Listen. Stop breathing for a moment and just listen. There is a sound beneath the silence. A drip. Slow, methodical. Each drop striking stone in a darkness so total it feels solid. The sound of infinite time passing in the dark. The heartbeat of a stone prison. And then another sound. A breath. Wet. Heavy. A broken bellows struggling for air in a place where the air is old and stale. It is not the breath of a man. It is too deep, too guttural. And it is not the breath of an animal. There is a sadness, a weariness in that sound that no animal has ever known. Now, the third sound. The most terrifying. A scrape. A hoof, heavy, dragging on the stone. Not a step, but a drag, as if the weight of the world is on that single leg. It scrapes, then stops. The heavy breathing stops. It is listening. It is listening for you, for your heart, which is now pounding like a frantic drum, for your own breath, which you are desperately trying to hold. In this absolute darkness, you have become a sound, and it is the silence that hunts you. You do not know what it is, but you feel its loneliness like a wave of cold. And you understand the most horrifying truth of all. You are not its first company, and you will not be its last. This is not the story of a monster. It is the story of a child who was never allowed to be human. It is the story of a prison built to hide a king's shame, and of the tortured soul forced to call it home. This is the story of Asterion, the starry prince, the victim at the center of the labyrinth, the creature, the world, in its cruel simplicity, named the Minotaur. His existence was born from a sin, not his own, but his father's. Minos, king of Crete, a man whose ambition was a fire that threatened to consume the sky. To prove his divine right to rule, he prayed to Poseidon, the god of earthquakes and oceans, to send him a sign, a bull, as white as the sea foam, to be sacrificed in his honor. Poseidon, perhaps to test the king's piety, or perhaps out of divine whim, agreed. From the depths of the sea emerged a creature of breathtaking beauty, a being not of this world, whose coat shone with a pearlescent light, and whose eyes held the deep calm of the ocean. Minos was awestruck. This creature was not a mere animal. It was perfection. It was power. It was a symbol of his own greatness, and the idea of slaughtering such magnificence on an altar became a sacrilege in his greedy mind. In an act of hubris that would poison his entire bloodline, Minos decided to cheat a god. He hid the sacred bull among his own herds and sacrificed a common one in its place, hoping the Lord of the Sea would not notice the difference. But a god always notices. Poseidon did not unleash a tidal wave. He did not sink the island of Crete. His revenge was more subtle, more psychological, and infinitely more cruel. He did not punish the king, but the queen, not the body, but the soul. Upon Queen Pasiphae, Minos' wife, he cast a curse, an unnatural desire, a monstrous, all-consuming lust for the snow-white bull. It was not attraction. It was a madness, a sickness of the soul that consumed her, turning her every thought into a feverish obsession. Tormented, on the verge of insanity, Pasiphae sought out the one man on the island whose genius was so great it had no moral compass. Daedalus, the inventor, the architect, the man who could build anything, even the unthinkable. He listened to the queen's confession not with horror, but with the cold curiosity of an engineer facing a complex problem. And his solution was a masterpiece of technical perversion. He built a wooden cow, hollow on the inside, covered it with the hide of a real heifer and mounted it on wheels. It was so realistic it could fool an animal, an empty shell for an empty desire. Pasiphae hid inside this grotesque structure, and Poseidon's curse was fulfilled in an act of profanity that made the cosmos shudder. The result of this union was a birth shrouded in terror. When the newborn's first cry echoed through the palace halls, it was not the clear sound of an heir to the throne. It was a broken sound, a mixture of a baby's wail and the distressed lowing of a calf. The handmaidens, pale with fear, wrapped him in precious cloths and brought him to the king. Minos, the great king, looked upon the face of his son, and his world collapsed. The body was that of a baby, small and perfect, but the head was that of a bull. Dark, liquid eyes stared up at him with innocent confusion. A wet snout, and two small nubs on his forehead. The promise of future horns. This was not a son. It was a living monument to his sin. It was his shame made flesh. It was Poseidon's laughter echoing for eternity. In a fit of cruel irony, he named him Asterion, the Starry Prince, a name that evoked the light of the heavens for a creature who would be condemned to perpetual darkness. Minos' order was immediate and absolute. This mistake had to be erased, hidden, buried. He called for Daedalus again, not to build a cradle, but a tomb, an architectural prison so diabolically complex it could contain not just a body, but a secret. Daedalus, whose genius was untroubled by conscience, set to work. He designed the labyrinth. It was not a mere maze. It was a psychological weapon, a place of total disorientation, with corridors that sloped, corners that deceived the eye, and acoustics designed to turn every whisper into a monstrous echo. At its center, a chamber, and into that chamber, Minos had his son, Asterion, thrown. Imagine that child. A baby with the mind of a human and the nascent instincts of a bull, cast into a darkness he had never known. The first years were an inferno of solitude. The cold of the stone was his only touch. The dripping of water, his only companion. He may have cried, but his cries were lost in the twisting corridors. He may have called for a mother, but the only answer was the distorted echo of his own voice. His senses were under constant assault. The total darkness denied his bull's eyes the vastness of fields. The absolute silence denied his human ear the comfort of a kind word. It was a sensory torture designed to break the mind, and slowly, inexorably, Asterion's mind broke. His humanity, fragile and unnourished, began to retreat. His feet hardened, turning to hooves to walk a floor that had never known grass. His voice, having never learned to form words, devolved into grunts and bellows, primal expressions of fear and frustration. But the worst torment was the hunger. A hunger that grew with his hybrid body. A hunger that could not be sated. Minos, in his ruthless practicality, found a solution. After defeating Athens in a war, he imposed a tribute of blood. Every 9 years, 7 young men and 7 young women from Athens would be sent to Crete. Not as slaves, but as fodder. They were thrown into the labyrinth. One by one, a human sacrifice to appease a monster the king himself had created to hide his own shame. Asterion did not choose to become a cannibal. He was trained to be one. The first time a terrified youth was thrown into his world, Asterion was as scared as he was. But the hunger that was eating him from the inside out, was a demon greater than any fear. Instinct took over, and with the first taste of human flesh, his doom was sealed. Minos had found a way to feed his secret, and Asterion had learned the most horrific lesson. To survive, he had to become the monster everyone feared him to be. The hunt became a ritual of despair. The screams of his victims were a torment, a reflection of his own imprisoned agony. He hunted them to end the sound, to end the reminder of his own fear. But after every act of violence, the silence returned, heavier and emptier than before. He would sit among the bones, the grisly remains of his only fleeting social interactions, and the loneliness would wash over him. He was not a monster reveling in his nature. He was a prisoner despairing in his cell, repeating the only behavior he had ever been taught. Years passed. The blood tribute became a legend, a horror story to frighten children. And then, one day, a hero arrived. Theseus, the Prince of Athens, volunteered as part of the tribute, secretly intending to end the barbarism. He was not like the others. Fear did not paralyze him. His mind was sharp, his will was iron, and he had an ally, Ariadne, Minos' own daughter, who had fallen in love with him and his courage. She gave him a sword and a ball of thread, a lifeline to find his way out of the darkness. When Theseus entered the labyrinth, he entered Asterion's soul. The darkness, the smell of death, the pregnant silence. Unspooling the thread, he delved into the heart of the prison, and there he found him. Not in the middle of a gruesome feast, not in a fit of rage. He found him in a large cavern, sitting silently among the white bones. His massive bull's head bowed, as if lost in a dream or a nightmare. The sound of Theseus's footsteps startled him. Asterion looked up, and for a long, silent moment, the two stared at each other. The hero and the monster, the light and the shadow. But in Asterion's eyes, Theseus did not see the murderous fury he expected. He saw an ancient weariness, a sadness so profound it seemed like an ocean. He saw a soul that had stopped fighting long ago. In that gaze, Asterion did not see prey. He saw an end. He saw an exit. The myth tells of a fierce battle. But the truth, perhaps, is far more tragic. Perhaps Asterion rose, not to attack, but to welcome. Perhaps his charge was not an assault, but an offering, a way to hasten the inevitable. Or perhaps he simply stood still, a willing target in the darkness, and watched the blade of Theseus glint like a distant star. Perhaps when the sword sank into his chest, the first touch that was not cold stone or screaming flesh, he did not feel pain. He felt gratitude. His last breath was not a roar, but a sigh. A long, shuddering release of years of loneliness, hunger, and madness. And then, silence. The beat of Theseus's heart. The monster was dead. The hero had won. But as Theseus pulled his sword from the fallen body, looking at that tragic form, half man, half beast, perhaps he understood the truth. He had not killed a monster. He had performed a mercy killing. And this forces us to ask, who was the real monster? Asterion, the creature born from the sin of others, imprisoned in darkness, forced to become a cannibal to survive, driven mad by a loneliness that would shatter any human mind, a beast acting on an instinct that was violently forced upon him? Or was the real monster Minos, the pious and powerful king whose arrogance started it all? The man who, when faced with his mistake, chose to bury it alive rather than confront it. The father who turned his son into an abomination to protect his own reputation. The story of the Minotaur is not a fable about a hero slaying a monster. It is a mirror, a dark mirror that reflects our own capacity to create monsters. We create them with our fear of the different. We build them with the bricks of our shame and our pride. We imprison them in the labyrinths of our prejudice and our ignorance. We feed them a steady diet of contempt and isolation. And then, when they act exactly like the beasts we have forced them to become, we send our heroes to destroy them, and we feel righteous for it. Asterion was never the monster of the labyrinth. He was its first prisoner, its first victim. The real monster was the king who sat on his throne, in the full light of day, surrounded by his court, while in the darkness beneath his feet, his own son suffered an unimaginable agony. The real labyrinth was not the one of stone. It was the twisted heart of Minos. A heart where the love for a child had been devoured by the love for power. We create our own monsters, and then we punish them for being exactly what we made them. That is the true tragedy of Asterion. And until we learn to look into our own personal labyrinths, we will continue to hear, in the darkness, the sound of a heavy breath and the scrape of a hoof on stone, never realizing the sound is coming from inside ourselves. Think of what it means to be Asterion. It is not a matter of physical form, of having a bull's head and a human body. It is a matter of a broken identity. You are born from an act of desecration, the result of a divine curse, the living symbol of your father's shame. As a child, you knew nothing of this. That your body was not like others. That your breath was deeper, your instinct wilder. Perhaps, in the early days, before you were thrown into the labyrinth, you saw the sun. Perhaps you felt the wind on your skin. Perhaps you heard a human voice, even if it was not directed at you. Perhaps you tried, for a brief moment, to be part of a world larger than yourself. But then, the labyrinth, and all that you had been, all that you might have become, was buried under tons of stone and darkness. The labyrinth was not just a physical prison. It was a psychological one, a cage built around your very mind. Every corridor was a twisted thought. Every dead end was a shattered hope. The darkness was your consciousness, constantly reminding you that you were alone, that no one was coming, that no one would ever come, and the hunger. The hunger is the true meaning of Asterion's story. It is not simply the need for food. It is a hunger that consumes the soul. It is the hunger for human contact, for love, for belonging, twisted into a primal instinct for survival. Every time a young Athenian was thrown into the labyrinth, Asterion did not see prey. He saw a possibility for interaction, however brief and terrible. He saw another living soul in a world of death. And when the hunger drove him to action, it was not cruelty, it was desperation. Imagine Asterion psychology after years of this cycle. After the 10th tribute, the 20th, after killing countless youths, each one representing a moment of connection, however distorted. His mind was not that of a monster. It was that of a deeply traumatized human being, whose capacity for love had been corrupted by ignorance, whose capacity for empathy had been destroyed by hunger. Perhaps, in his lucidity, when the silence was torn, the was saved. Asterion wept. He wept for what he was, for what he could never become, for the lives he had taken because he did not know how to do otherwise. Daedalus, the architect of the labyrinth, bore the weight of this knowledge. He had built the prison. He had designed the every aspect of the sensory torture that was the labyrinth. He knew that inside was a suffering creature. He knew that creature was the king's son, and he knew that his genius had been used to perpetuate an injustice. Perhaps, in quiet moments, he wondered if his talent was a blessing or a curse, if his ability to build wonderful things was a responsibility. If genius without conscience was worse than conscious ignorance, Minos, lived in a conscious state. He sat honestly, listened to the reports of intrigues, and convinced himself that he was doing right, that he was protecting his kingdom, that the sacrifice of the Athenian youths was an acceptable cost to pay to keep the secret of shame. The price was written on his heart. Every night, perhaps, he heard the sound of the labyrinth, dripping water, the heavy breath of the sun, echoing in the corridors of his mind. Perhaps he wondered if Asterion hated him. If, somehow, his son understood that he had been abandoned not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear is the true engine of Asterion's tragedy. Minos' fear of losing the kingdom, Pasiphae's fear of facing her curse, Daedalus' fear of refusing a commission, Asterion fear of death, and Theseus' fear of falling into the labyrinth. Because Theseus was not a fearless hero. He was a man, chosen to face the unknown to save his people. He stood before Asterion, and he saw that massive creature, with eyes full of an ancient sadness. Perhaps he felt a compassion he did not expect. Perhaps, for a moment, he saw not a monster, but a victim. Theseus's sword was an act of mercy, not heroism. It was the end of a suffering that had lasted too long. It was the release of a soul that had been trapped in a body that was not its own, in a world that had never wanted it. And perhaps, when Asterion fell, his last thought was not of anger or regret, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the end. Gratitude for the release. Gratitude that, finally, the dripping of the water would stop. But the real tragedy is not Asterion's death. It is the fact that the world never knew his name. It is the fact that he was reduced to a legend, a beast, a monster to be told to children. His real name, Asterion, the Starry Prince, was forgotten, and with it, his humanity, his suffering, his innocence. And this is the final message of this story. It is not a warning against arrogance. It is not a lesson about divine justice. It is an indictment of our ability to create victims and then forget that they are. It is an indictment of our need to have monsters so that we do not have to face the monsters within ourselves. Asterion was the perfect scapegoat. He was different. He was frightening. He was easy to hate. And so, we relegated him to the darkness and built a story around him that made him the villain. We turned his suffering into entertainment. We turned his isolation into legend. How many Asterions live today in our modern labyrinths? How many human beings have been cast into darkness because they are different? How many have been fed contempt and isolation until they have become the very beasts we told them they were? How many continue to hear the dripping of the water, the heavy breath of loneliness, the scrape of their own pain on the stone of their prison? The story of Asterion does not end with Theseus' sword. It ends when we look into our own labyrinths and recognize the monster we have created. It ends when we choose to build bridges instead of walls. It ends when we decide that diversity is not a threat, but a richness. It ends when we choose empathy over fear. Until that moment, we will continue to hear the sound, the drip, the heavy breath, the scrape of the hoof. Because the labyrinth was never a prison of stone, it has always been a prison of the heart. And as long as our heart remains a labyrinth, we will continue to create monsters to inhabit it.